Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Sagas of Swamp Thing. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 13. And just a little catch up on what happened in the last issue. In the last issue we saw Swamp Thing going around through time. He had found a mysterious pink stone in the swamps, and when he touched it, it sent him back to dinosaur times. And immediately he had to fight a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and it was looking like he might not make it, but luckily a man came out of nowhere and saved his life, but died in the process. But the second that man died, the stone began to glow, and Swamp Thing traveled to another time period. Then the man who we thought dead got up like nothing happened and walked away. And this same event basically happened in every time period that Swamp Thing traveled to. Every time he would get somewhere, he'd try to find his bearings. The second he did, something bad would happen and he would have to fight. And then when it looked like he was about to lose, all of a sudden this man that looked very similar in every period would come out and save him. Then he would become mortally wounded. Then the stone would glow. Then Swamp Thing would disappear and the man would get up and continue living. And this continued through 4 or 5 different time periods until finally they met in the present day. And through all of this, the man figured out that he was cursed with immortality that would go on as long as he was not killed by a friend. And now that Swamp Thing has met him in a bunch of different time periods, they both realize, hey, we're kind of friends. And he asked Swamp Thing to kill him. And even though that would be merciful, Swamp Thing says he will not kill him. And unfortunately, as Swamp Thing's walking away, the man follows after him in the swamp and falls in some quicksand and dies. But this time, the stone does not light up. Swamp Thing does not travel anywhere special. So the man is cursed to relive everything once again, but this time without Swamp Thing hanging out with him. And as Swamp Thing is doing his whole time travel adventure thing, in the background we see Matt Cable, Abby, Arcane, and Bolt, and they are having a little talk where Bolt is saying he wants to kill Swamp Thing. He says because Swamp Thing let Ruth die, but Matt Cable confronts him and says, no, you're not angry at Swamp Thing because of that. You're just bigoted. You want someone to blame, and you want to blame the big monster guy. And at first, Bolt did not like what he was hearing from Matt Cable, but eventually they worked out a deal where Bolt decided Matt Cable was right, and he would help Matt Cable find the Swamp Thing so that they can help him instead of hurt him. And with that, we're all caught up. So first things first with issue 13, we got the cover. We see Swamp Thing is bursting out of the ground in a graveyard in front of a grave. Of course, there's a big full moon in the background, and we can't see whose grave it is. It just says, here lies, and then the name is obscured by the dirt that's coming up from him digging out of the ground. And as we turn to the first page, we see some sort of craft going through the swamp. The vehicle looks kind of like a mix of a speedboat and a hovercraft. So as it speeds through the water, we get some narration that says, night sounds, the cacophonous croaking of a bullfrog, the measured beating of a heron's wings, the sibilant slither of some great reptile settling into sleep. This is the bayou at twilight, a symphony of sound that suddenly ceases as a new sound intrudes upon the scene, the powerful thrum of a swiftly moving swamp boat, carrying a handful of dedicated seekers into the midst of a budding nightmare. Then we get a close-up of everybody who's inside of this speedboat, and we can see Matt Cable, Bolt, and Abby, and another man who is white, who was wearing glasses, and he is driving. And Bolt is talking to Matt, saying, Cable, the place you're looking for is right about there. And Bolt is pointing to a location on a map that Matt Cable is looking at, and Matt replies, are you sure, Bolt? After coming all this way again, I'd hate to waste time on a wild goose chase. And then Bolt pulls out an artist concept drawing of Swamp Thing, and he points to the figure on the paper and he says, look, fella, you want help tracking down this ugly creep. Okay, but don't start telling me my business. I was born in this overgrown muck pond. I know my way around. And then he crumples the picture of Swamp Thing up, and he continues saying, and I'm as determined to capture the Swamp Thing as the rest of you are. Now stop arguing and let's keep moving. Then we turn the page and we see Swamp Thing is fighting a bunch of different mutated animals in the swamp. He's holding a giant mutated frog over his head while a snake is coiling around his legs. And behind him we see an alligator walking on 2 legs who looks very buff, is coming up out of the water like he's about to attack Swamp Thing. And as Swamp Thing wrestles with them, he thinks, congratulations, I've proven my latest theory. Now the only problem is staying alive long enough to tell anyone else. And we see on this page that the name of this issue is called The Leviathan Conspiracy, and it is written by Len Wein with art by Nestor Redondo. And I believe that this is the last issue that Len Wein writes, at least in this volume of Swamp Thing. And this is considered like the end of the Len Wein, Bernie Wrightson era, even though Nestor Redondo illustrated this issue and the last one too. And as we turn the page, we see Swamp Thing take that frog that he was holding over his head, and he brings the frog down on his knee and breaks its back. Very reminiscent, in fact, of Bane when he breaks Batman's back. So as he kills this frog, he thinks, "Ever since I rescued Matt Cable and his lady friend from that alligator thing a few days ago, something has been preying on my mind." And we get a little editor's note that they're talking about stuff that happened in issue 11. And if you remember, there was a giant gator monster that they fought in that issue. And as Swamp Thing discards the frog, he thinks, where did the creature come from? And why? But his thoughts are interrupted as the gator monster that was behind him attacks. But before it can really do any damage, Swamp Thing reaches over his head behind him and grabs the gator monster and leans forward, hurling the gator monster over the front of him. And all the while, the snake is still wrapped around his legs, so as Swamp Thing's doing this, his thoughts continue, saying, why did it seem to resemble me? Why was its body covered with moss and tangled with roots the way mine is? The way these creatures are. But his thoughts are cut off once again as the snake that is coiled around his midsection strikes, and Swamp Thing is able to grab it with both hands so that it doesn't bite him. And as he's struggling with the coiled behemoth, he thinks, and that is what settled the matter. One swampish look-alike I might have accepted as an amazing fluke of nature, but a whole army of them? No. And as he says no, he grabs the snake by the tail, and then he whips the snake so that its head smashes into a tree, and I assume it dies because it stops moving as it falls to the water. And as this is happening, Swamp Thing continues thinking, there's something about the swamp itself. Some sort of chemical imbalance. It helped turn me into the Swamp Thing, and slowly it's doing the same thing to everyone else that lives here. And knowing the possible cause of my condition, maybe I can finally find a cure for it. And just as Swamp Thing's thinking that, suddenly a net comes down on top of him, and as he fights to remove it and turns to see who threw it on him, he sees Matt Cable and company, and he thinks, Matt Cable and his band of merry men. I should have known. Doesn't he ever give up? And it doesn't look like the net is giving him any trouble because he's just pulling it apart. And the white guy with glasses who was driving the boat sees this and he says, look, the creature snaps the steel netting as if it were twine. And as Swamp Thing throws off the broken pieces of the net, he begins to walk towards them. And this new guy exclaims, and now it's coming after us. But Bolt and Matt step in front of him, and they point these very weird-looking guns at Swamp Thing, and Matt says to the man, calm down, Professor DeGrez, and have a little faith in these foam guns you designed. And with that, Matt and Bolt both begin spraying foam out of the guns at Swamp Thing, and as he gets covered with the foam, Swamp Thing thinks, huh? Foam, spreading all over my body, smothering me. Cable, stop! Don't do this! You can't take me away from this swamp now. Not now. And once he's fully covered with the foam, they don't really say, but I think it actually freezes hard around Swamp Thing, so he can't move, and he falls down flat in front of them. And as he does, Matt Cable says, okay, let's pack him up and get going. We have a date in Washington. Then we turn the page, and we cut to Fenwick Military Academy, which is on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., and we see either future soldiers or new recruits drilling and training. But then we cut to the inside of the building and we see Matt Cable, Abby Arcane, and a new person walking. And we're told by the text that the new guy is called John Zero. And John is saying to Matt Cable, an excellent job, Matthew. The secretary asked me to extend his congratulations. But Matt Cable doesn't seem happy about this at all. He says, you can stuff your congratulations, Commander, until you tell me what you've done with this Swamp Thing. And Abby actually seems surprised at Matt's outburst, and she says, Matt, please, you shouldn't talk to Mr. Zero that way. And Mr. Zero says, it's quite all right, Miss Arcane. Matthew's monster is in the best of hands. We are, in fact, on our way to visit him right now. Then they reach the end of a hallway and a very, very large metal door. And the narration in this panel says, the corridor ends in a slab of steel. But as John Zero presses the fingertips of one hand against the cold, unyielding barrier, the ringing clangor of lock bolts falling into place echoes down the metallic hallway. Silently, the wall slides upwards, and Matt Cable and his lovely companion step softly through the burnished gates of purgatory. And as Matt and Abby enter the room, Abby exclaims, "Oh my dear God, no!" And as we turn the page, we see why she's exclaiming. It's because they have Swamp Thing in basically a human-sized terrarium. It's an all-glass box, just like a couple feet taller than Swamp Thing is. And it's almost like they've recreated a little section of swamp in there. There's about a foot of water on the ground, and there's a small tree and a bunch of moss and other plant life from the swamp. And as Matt Cable sees this terrarium and Dr. DeGrez is standing there at some machinery, he says, "In God's name, DeGrez, what are you doing to him?" And Dr. DeGrez stands and answers, "Oh, hello, Cable. Miss Arcane. Don't worry about your monster. He's perfectly safe. The hydroponic tank we've contained him in virtually duplicates the conditions of his natural environment. He'll stay there until we've completed our investigation of his origins. And then, who knows? A place of honor in the Smithsonian, perhaps." And Matt doesn't like the sound of that, so he gets up into Dr. DeGrez's face and he says, "You're going to kill it when you're done? Fat chance, Professor. Somehow that monster is tied up with the deaths of Alec and Linda Holland, a case I was in charge of. And if you think I'm going to let you kiss off my star witness before I get to the bottom of that case, you're flat out crazy." And while Cable is yelling at Dr. DeGrez, we see Abby, who's not saying anything, just walk over to Swamp Thing, and Swamp Thing turns and he looks at her very sadly through the glass, and he presses his face and hands against it, and almost like she can feel his sadness and despair, she puts her hand up to his on the glass. But before she can do or say anything else, Matt Cable grabs her arm and pulls her away as he storms out of the room and says to Dr. DeGrez, "I swear I'll blow this whole operation wide open before I'd let you do that. Come on, Abby, let's get out of here. The air in this place stinks." So as Matt and Abby leave, Dr. DeGrez doesn't really seem bothered by them. He just pulls out a microphone and he continues talking about his experimenting on Swamp Thing. And he's saying, "Project codename Leviathan. Report number 28N. Continued. The creature continues to indicate obvious signs of intelligence. It now appears to be investigating the perimeters of its cell, as if searching for some weak point, some means of escape." And what he's saying about Swamp Thing is actually happening in real time. Now that Swamp Thing has seen Abby and Matt, it seems like maybe he thinks he can get out of here. So he begins to examine the box, and as he finds a weak point, he starts hitting it with his hands. And Dr. DeGrez continues to narrate what he's seeing, and he says, "Wait, the creature seems to have found what it was looking for. It's begun to hammer at a portion of its glassite cell wall repeatedly, attempting futilely to shatter it." But just as he says that, Swamp Thing smashes into the glass with his shoulder, and a crack forms on the wall. And of course, this freaks Dr. DeGrez out, but he still continues to talk into the microphone, and he's saying, "No, the creature is far stronger than we estimated. It has increased its efforts, and the glass has begun to crack. I must do something to stop it before... No! Oh no!" And with that, Swamp Thing smashes through the glass wall, but as he jumps out onto firm ground, the guards in the room begin to fire on him with their M16s, and they yell to Dr. DeGrez, "Don't worry, Professor. We'll stop this monster." And as they shoot at him, Swamp Thing thinks, "I didn't want to have to do it this way, but I had no choice. Can't let them keep me here to find out what I know." And surprisingly, Dr. DeGrez is worried about Swamp Thing's safety, and he tries to run towards the guards and he yells, "No, stop shooting! The creature mustn't be harmed! He's too valuable to science!" And as DeGrez runs in between Swamp Thing and the shooting guards, Swamp Thing thinks, "DeGrez, you fool! Stay back!" But it's too late. DeGrez throws himself in front of all the bullets that are coming at Swamp Thing, and he gets hit by them. And the guards exclaim, "Professor! Oh my God, we've shot him! Professor, what have we done to you?" And Swamp Thing leans down immediately, and he goes to the aid of Dr. DeGrez, and as he rolls him over face up on the ground, we see him think, "You've killed him, you gibbering idiot. I'm sorry, DeGrez. I didn't intend for things to end this way." But as Swamp Thing thinks this, we see the guards have dropped their M16s, and they've noticed the foam guns on the wall, and so they grab those and they begin to shoot Swamp Thing with them. And as the foam hits Swamp Thing, he thinks, "No, that blasted foam again." And once again, once he's fully covered, Swamp Thing falls to the ground, unable to move, and the guard says to him, "Filthy monster, It's your fault the professor is dead, and believe me, you're gonna pay for it. Then we turn to the next page and we cut to the following morning, and we're still in the lab, and we see Swamp Thing is back in another terrarium, but this time surrounding the terrarium, there is a fence that is made of lasers. And we see Mr. Zero is talking to Matt Cable as they look at Swamp Thing, and Zero's saying, "We've restored the hydroponic chamber and installed a system of high-potency laser beams around it. If the creature attempts a second escape, it will never attempt a third. By the way, Cable, I'm placing you in charge of the funeral arrangements. Something simple, inconspicuous. We have no need of publicity." And Cable replies, "I understand, Commander. In a way, I almost feel responsible for Professor DeGrez's death. But maybe there's something I can do to make up for it. Maybe I can find the answers that cost the professor his life. Maybe I can learn the secret of the Swamp Thing." And Mr. Zero's ears perk up at that, and he asks, "Oh, and how do you propose to accomplish that?" And Matt Cable points to Swamp Thing's terrarium, and he says, "I want you to clear everyone out of here, then put me in there, so I can talk to the Swamp Thing alone." And Mr. Zero's taken aback by this, and he says, "Are you serious, Matthew? After you've seen a sample of that creature's power?" And Matt replies, "Commander, that creature also saved my life more times than I can count. Somehow I find it hard to believe that it would harm me now." And then Mr. Zero turns and walks away from Matt, and he says, "I may not share your confidence, Matthew, but neither can I argue your sentiments. All right, I'll make all the necessary arrangements, but please, don't give me cause to regret this." Then we turn the page and we cut to sometime later in the laboratory, and we see Matt Cable has some sort of clean suit on as he's walking into the terrarium towards Swamp Thing. And the narration over this panel says, "A study in irony. Matt Cable, clad in clean white coveralls to protect his clothing from the brackish environment that composes the very substance of the creature to whom he seeks so desperately to communicate. But still he tries." So as Matt Cable walks into the terrarium, he says to Swamp Thing, "Hi, fella. Mind if I talk to you a while?" And Swamp Thing just stares at him, so Matt continues, "You know, you've caused me quite a bit of trouble, making me chase you all across the world, then popping up unannounced all those times to save my stupid life. You've put me in your debt. You know that, don't you? And it's a debt I don't know how to repay." And it seems that Matt wants Swamp Thing to say or do something, but Swamp Thing just stares at him sadly with his eyes, and Matt Cable gets kind of mad and he says, "Oh, come on, blast you! Answer me, say something! I know you're intelligent. You must be able to speak. Why in God's name don't you?" And once again, Swamp Thing just stares at him silently, and this infuriates Matt Cable more, and Matt says, "Damn it! I'm trying to save your mossy hide! Speak to me!" But Swamp Thing just continues to stare at Matt with sad eyes, and he thinks, "I wish I could, Matt. Lord, I wish I could. But the secret I hold, the secret of the biorestorative formula, it's too dangerous for anyone else to learn. But, on the other hand, what choice do I have? If I don't confide in Cable, his colleagues will simply kill me and learn the secret by studying my corpse. No, I have no choice. I must tell Cable that." And then he says out loud to Matt Cable, "I am Alec Holland." And a very shocked Matt Cable exclaims, "Oh my God!" And then he turns and he begins to hit the glass with his fist, and he says, "Alec, oh God, part of me always knew, I suppose, when we couldn't find your body in the ruins of the barn. Part of me knew, but refused to admit it. How, Alec? How did it happen?" Then we get some panels that do a quick retelling of the origin of Swamp Thing from the first issue. And these panels represent Swamp Thing telling Cable what happened. So we get some narration over them that says, "Slowly, his rarely used voice little more than a bubbling rasp, the muck-encrusted once man retells the painful tale of how he and his lovely wife Linda refused to sell their biorestorative secret to an organization called the Conclave, a decision which resulted in the sabotage of their laboratory barn, which in turn resulted in an explosion of devastating scope, an explosion which drove an agonized Alec Holland into the stagnant waters of the surrounding bog, seeking relief, but finding only a different kind of torment. His chemical-enveloped body was somehow nurtured by the swamp, absorbing its filth, assimilating its rot and decay, until he rose at last from the grasping mire, a misshapen mockery of life, no longer a man, but a swamp thing. And as Swamp Thing finishes telling this story to Matt Cable, Matt looks at him with empathy and says, "My God, Alec, what you must have endured. Question now is, what do we do about it? That's going to take some thinking. But when I've thought it all out, Alec, I'll be back. I promise you, I'll be back." So he leaves Swamp Thing, and as we turn the page, we cut to Matt Cable's apartment, and he's just finishing recounting the story of Swamp Thing to Abby, who's sitting in his living room as well, and he's saying, "And that's the whole story, Abby. Just like Alec told it to me. And frankly, I don't know what to do. We've spent so much effort in capturing him, only to have it all turn sour. How can we leave him there, Abby? I owe him my life. We both owe him our lives. If it weren't for Alec, the Patchwork Man, that crazy werewolf, that robot freak from the Conclave, the alien, those hideous worms, any one of them might have finished us off. After all that, Abby, how in God's name can I just leave him to the tender mercies of the government? Tell me, Abby, what should I do?" And Abby stands up and puts her hand on his chest and says, "You know the answer to that far better than I do, Matthew. Do what your heart tells you to do." And with that, Matt Cable gets his resolve and he says, "Then it's settled, Abby. I don't know how yet, but I'm going to get him out of there, or die trying." Then we cut to shortly after midnight that same day, and we see Abby and Matt are skulking around the government building in very tight black spy suits. They have white gun belts around them, and for some reason, they're wearing yellow boots. And as they're sneaking around a corner, Matt says to Abby, "You know you shouldn't be here, Abby. This is something I have to do, but I'd never forgive myself if anything happened to you." And Abby replies, "I know, Matthew, but this is something I must do as well. You've suffered alone for far too long. Whatever happens tonight, I want to be with you." And Matt says, "I appreciate that, Abby, but I only hope you don't come to regret it." And then he puts on some kind of plastic yellow glove, and he continues saying, "Because if this plastoid glove I devised to duplicate Commander Zero's fingerprints works, you may be following me straight into hell." And with that, Cable puts his gloved hand against the wall, and the glove works. The steel door to Swamp Thing's laboratory opens up, and as it does, Matt Cable and Abby rush in with gas masks on, and they throw some sort of gas grenades into the room to knock out the guards. And as the grenades go off, the guards yell, "What in the... It's knockout gas!" And then they fall to the ground asleep. And then Matt Cable walks towards Swamp Thing's cage and he says out loud, "Well, don't just stand there gawking, Alec. Get back to the far side of your cage. Back out of harm's way." And then Matt pulls out a grenade and he pulls the pin and he throws it towards the glass wall of the terrarium that is farthest from Swamp Thing, and he continues saying to Swamp Thing, "'Cause mister, we've come to bust you out of here, and we haven't got time to waste." And with that, the grenade goes off and shatters the glass, and also takes out the laser beam fence that was surrounding the glass terrarium. And Swamp Thing immediately walks out of his glass prison, and as he does, we see Matt Cable kneel down near some of the equipment, and he seems to be playing with some wires, and he says, "Okay, let's move it. Alec, pick up those guards and get him out of here. Abby, do what you can to help him. I've still got a few things to take care of." And Abby replies, "Whatever you say, Matthew." Then we cut to them all walking out, and we see Matt Cable pull something from his pocket. It seems to be some sort of transmitter because he pushes a button, and he says to them, "I planted explosive charges all over the place in there, and once I set them off," then as the steel door finishes closing, all of a sudden we hear a big explosion in the room, and then Matt Cable continues to say, "There won't be enough left in the lab to scrape into a paper sack." And then Swamp Thing sets the passed out guards just outside of the door, and they begin moving quicker as Matt continues to talk, saying, "The heat will quickly fuse those steel doors shut, and by the time they manage to break in, all they'll find is ashes. I'm hoping they'll figure that some of those ashes are you, Alec. If they think you're dead, the pressure will be off and we can..." But just as Matt is explaining how clever his plan is and how they'll think Swamp Thing's dead, we hear someone yell from behind him, "Okay, hold it. Right where you are." And as Abby turns to see who's talking, she says, "Oh no, not you." And as Matt wheels around, he sees who it is and he exclaims, "Bolt, what the hell do you think you're doing, man?" And we see Bolt is standing there with one of the M16s and he's saying, What does it look like I'm doing, man? I'm stopping you from busting that swamp slop out of here. And of course, they don't have time for this, so Matt Cable tries to explain, saying, Look, Bolt, I don't have time to explain why now, but believe me, you're making a mistake. We've got to get Swamp Thing away from here, and fast. But Bolt isn't hearing any of that. He says, Then you're going to have to go through me to do it. And Matt Cable doesn't hesitate. He lunges for Bolt and he says, I was afraid you were going to say that, mister. And Bolt actually does fire his gun. I'm not sure if it's on accident because Matt is tackling him or if because he was actually going to shoot Matt Cable. But either way, Matt is able to grab the M16 from him. And as Matt punches Bolt in the face, he continues his sentence from the tackle saying, But frankly, at the moment, that doesn't particularly make a real big difference to me. But it's going to take more than a punch from Matt Cable to knock Bolt out. And Bolt is able to shove Matt Cable away from him saying, Me neither, tough man. I knew you were going crackers when I heard you ask to speak to that big green ugly alone. That's why I've been waiting here, for you to pull just the kind of stunt you did. And Matt Cable is not very happy about any of this, as you can imagine. And as he squares off with Bolt, he says, Bolt, you don't get out of our way, and I'll pull a stunt that'll cripple you. I mean it, mister. Step aside or I'll walk right over you. And then he raises his fist threateningly towards Bolt. But Bolt, of course, isn't scared, and he says, Then you just come ahead and try, so I can... But his words are cut off as Swamp Thing yells, Enough! And then Swamp Thing grabs Matt Cable's hand, and Cable exclaims, What in the... Then Swamp Thing walks in between Matt and Bolt, and he kind of puts his hands out like he's trying to get them to separate. And Bolt is surprised by this, and he says, Sweet mother of mercy! That thing talks almost as if it was a human. And then Matt Cable says, He is human. More than human. But that's what I've been trying to tell you. But I don't really have the right to tell you unless... And then he turns to Swamp Thing, and Swamp Thing nods yes at him. So once again, Matt Cable recounts Swamp Thing's story, but this time to Bolt. And after that's done, of course, Bolt is now on their side, and he says, Far freaking out, but I believe it. Somehow I believe it. And Matt Cable says, Then will you help us? That's all that really matters now. And Bolt takes a second to think, and he says, I must be as screwy as the rest of you, because the answer is yes. Tell me what you want me to do. So Matt Cable explains his plan to Bolt, but we don't hear it. It just says in the text that Matt Cable explains whatever he's come up with to Bolt. Then we turn the page and we cut to a funeral at a graveyard. And we see Matt Cable, Abby, and Mr. Zero are arriving. And the narration over this says, Which brings us to a secluded cemetery many miles from the nation's capital, sometime late in the following afternoon. As a trio of familiar figures, all clad in mourning black, prepare to join the depressingly small party already come to pay their last respects to the departed Professor Coolridge de Grez. So as the three walk up to the funeral area, Commander Zero says to Matt, By the time we cut our way into the laboratory, it was a total loss. Everything charred to a cinder, including your misbegotten monster, I'm afraid. And Matt suspiciously asks, Any idea who's responsible, Commander? And not suspecting anything, Zero answers, Not really, Matthew. The enemy. Some lunatic fringe, perhaps. In fact, that's your next assignment. The Secretary wants you to find out exactly who destroyed the Swamp Thing and why. Then we get some panels of the funeral service happening, and we see the casket being lowered into the ground and shovels throwing dirt into the hole. And over these panels, the narration says, The services are overly solemn but thankfully short, which is fortunate for Matthew Cable, who finds himself hard-pressed to keep from smiling smugly during the minister's sermon, for he already knows precisely what the results of his investigation will be. Still, by clenching his teeth, he manages to maintain the proper appearance of decorum as the ceremony concludes. The simple coffin is lowered heavily into the waiting earth, and the remains of what had once been Professor Coolridge de Grez disappears forever from the sight of men. Then, once the funeral is finished, we see the three walking back to their car from the graveyard, and Commander Zero is saying, Very nice, Matthew. Very nice indeed. Quite dignified. A shame the professor had no family. I think they would have appreciated the arrangements you made for the funeral. Then Matt replies, It was the least I could do for the man, Commander. Besides, it wasn't really any bother at all. Then we cut to the night as the moon is rising in the sky. We see some fog creep into the graveyard, and the narration says, The wind whistles lonely past the tombstones. spreading night across the landscape like a coverlet of ink. And for a time, nothing moves, nothing breathes in this kingdom of the dead, until abruptly the fresh-packed earth of the late professor's grave thrusts upwards, as if something was desperately pushing from below, something that quickly becomes recognizable as a mossy root-gnarled hand, clawing away the dirt, straining vainly for the sky. Then we see Swamp Thing's body burst through the ground, and as he surfaces, the narration continues, with a violent shudder that spews its hollowed soil widely in all directions. The grave bursts asunder, and the Swamp Thing erupts into the moonlight. And then Swamp Thing stands up, and he looks at the grave he's just come out of, and he thinks, "That may have been the tightest squeeze of my life, hiding in that special coffin Cable had made, wedged into the false bottom under DeGrez's body. But I have to give Matthew credit. It worked. It took a while to dig my way through 6 feet of dirt barehanded, but I guess it was worth it, since it got me out of Washington without being noticed. All I have to do now is rendezvous with Cable and his friends. Then, as Swamp Thing begins to walk away from the grave he came out of, he looks over and he sees 2 headstones, and the narration says, "The Swamp Thing stops suddenly, fairly rooted in his tracks, as his roomy, red-rimmed eyes behold a sight he'd never hoped to see. A pair of headstones inscribed with a pair of unbearably familiar names." Then we cut to a panel where we see the headstones, and they are the headstones of Alec and Linda Holland, and as Swamp Thing stares at them in shock, he thinks, "No, oh no, my own grave, and Linda's, darling Linda's. Oh God, Linda, what did I do to you? It's my fault you're dead. Me. And my damn dedication to duty. There were so many things I meant to tell you, Linda. So many plans we never made. So many dreams we never realized. All my fault." And then Swamp Thing falls to his knees and he continues thinking, "If there truly is a heaven, sweet Linda, I pray to God you're happy there. And there must be a heaven because I know there's a hell. I'm living in that hell right now." And then he sits for a moment to dwell on that, and then he thinks, "Well, I'd better get going. Cable and the others will be waiting for me. Waiting to do what? Who the hell do I think I'm kidding? There's nothing Cable can do for me. Nothing. Except maybe pity me, or come to share my curse. And Matt Cable is too fine a man to deserve a fate like that. It is time I finally admit it. There is no place in this world for something like me. All I can do is drag others down as well, and I'm not going to do that. No, it's time this little monster went home." And so Swamp Thing begins his walk from, I assume, Washington, D.C., all the way to Louisiana, and as he reaches the swamps, he stops for a minute, and the narration says, "At last, he reaches the stagnant marsh he sardonically calls home. It is only the swamp that is kind to him now. It is only the swamp that cares." For a moment he pauses, remembering Linda, remembering the man he used to be. And as he continues to walk into the swamp, we get a panel of him walking away from us towards a full moon, and the narration continues saying, "And if tears could come, they would." And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. And that is a very fitting end of the issue. If you remember in House of Secrets 92, that's basically how the first appearance of Swamp Thing ended, with the Swamp Thing Alex Olsen walking away into a swamp towards a full moon. And the same line, "If tears could come, they would," was over that as well. And that is a great bookend to this because this is the last issue that Len Wein writes. So with the next issue, we will be starting a new writer, but we will keep on Nestor Redondo with the art. So we'll have to see how Swamp Thing's adventures continue in the next issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.